Welcome to Skill-Based Art, a learning resource for art students and artist teachers. My name is Emilio Longo and I'm the founder and director of Skill-Based Art. Today I'd like to welcome you to the Langridge Artist Colours Paint Factory here in Yarraville, Melbourne. I'm joined by David Coles, who is the founder of Langridge Artist Colours and the master paint maker. David, thank you very much for inviting me to your fantastic paint factory today. I'm really excited to learn more about what goes into the process of making paints.
Emilio, it's my pleasure to have you here and be able to show to you and all of your audience how we make paints for the artist market.
Fantastic. Let's get into it.
Sure.
Now, David, your story is really interesting. Now, you originally from England.
Yeah.
You grew up around your mother's art store. So when you were about 11 years old, your mother basically owned an art store. So you kind of grew up with the smells of turpentine,
Yeah.
kind of part of your DNA, so to speak.
Yeah.
Eventually you went to art school and then you graduated. You started working for Robertson & Co., which is one of the oldest art supply stores in London, I believe.
One of the oldest manufacturers. They're older than Winsor Newton itself.
Wow.
So they were making paints for the Pre-Raphaelites and other artists from the mid-19th century onwards.
That's incredible. So from there, you basically went into their store, which is the famous Cornelissen & Son,
Yeah.
and you apprenticed there for some time.
Yeah.
So with this interesting background you have, can you provide a bit of a summary as to how it all began, how you got interested in art, and how your development in art actually evolved throughout the years?
Well, I basically started working in art materials, obviously because of the fact that my parents opened up an art shop, and it was just a kind of way of making some money. And at a very early age, my parents gave me a small set of pigments, little 30 ml jars of pigments, which suddenly opened up the world to me, realizing that this is the pure color from which paints are made from. And when you would open up the jars, it was like little jars of glass jars of powdered jewels, you know, the blues and the reds and everything like that. And I think that initially set me off on the idea of where materials come from with this finished product, this paint, whether it's an oil paint or a watercolor or an acrylic, but it actually the color comes from something quite material. It's not abstract. And then I went to art school, and I was very lucky. I went to art school in the early 80s, where material information was very much being looked at. Where people were very interested in the students I was certainly with in that those 3 years I was there. We were playing around with paints that hadn't been used for many years. So we had a couple of artist students who were working with making their own encaustic paints.
Sure.
We were very much encouraged to try and make our own paints, to make our own primers, stretch our own canvases. So there was a strong foundation in the craft of making your materials, which then gave you a closer understanding of what these materials were going to do in your own painting.
Sure.
It was a fabulous foundation in that sense. And then I moved to London because I wanted to be, in the heart of the world, and it's one of the great centres of the world, obviously, and especially for art.
Sure.
And especially in the mid-80s, where there was a lot of painting going on. And of course I needed a job, and I was just extremely lucky. I was able to get a job with Roberson and Company, I said one of the oldest artist paint manufacturers in the world. And then from there I was able to work at Cornelisson's, which of course is a store that was set up in the mid-19th century. It has all of its original shop fittings.
Wow.
In fact, they had been in one site for over 130 years. That was on over in Covent Garden, and unfortunately had to move from there and moved down to Great Russell Street, just up from the British Museum. And they literally disassembled the old shop with the original fittings and reassembled it. So when you go into Cornelisson's now, you are still surrounded by all of the original shop from 150 years ago. It's
That's fantastic.
quite beautiful, yeah.
Great.
The great thing about Cornelissen was the level of, expected level of information that was to be given to the customer, that the knowledge from the staff had to be of utmost accuracy, and again through I suppose you could call it a sort of system of osmosis. I learnt by just listening to my other staff members, those who had been there much longer, and just learnt the craft and the information behind all of these materials, some of which were incredibly esoteric, things that gums and balsams and oleoresins that really are hardly ever used nowadays, certainly in fine art. But of course it was important that we understood the nature of all of these. I was also very lucky because, again, a little bit like when I was at art school, I happened to be there when there was a group of fellow-minded members of staff And we were also experimenting with making our own paints, and I was playing
great.
around with egg oil emulsion grounds and my own primers. And so we all became kind of little home alchemists. We'd go home at the end of the day super excited about what we'd been working with all day and go and actually play some more in the evenings. And I think it was when I was there that I started to realize I actually had an affinity for making materials.
Sure.
A little bit like a chef. And that's the beauty, in a sense, at its most simple level, is making artist materials is actually very, very hands-on, especially with oil paints. It's much more touch and feel, as long as you've got the basics right. It's not complicated in a sort of chemistry way that, say, acrylic paint making is. That's another world again in manufacture of artist materials. So oil paint is very visceral, very direct, and it's a little bit like cooking.
Sure.
To be honest with you, I often talk about when I'm working on new recipes, and I very much use the word recipes, and it's like a chef just tweaking a little bit of this, and I know what all the raw materials will do. A little bit, again, as I said, with food, instead of it being a spice, it might be a particular color.
Sure.
Instead of it being milk or water or stock, I'm using oils, and developing it that way. And I still build new products from a very, very small starting point, quite small not even pilot batches, lab batches, and then slowly scale them up to make sure that they work on a bigger scale.
Great.
Run enormous amounts of tests over a 3-year period before we release products to make sure there's no issues in regards to failure. We don't want to be releasing a product into the marketplace that's going to fail on our customers.
Sure, of course.
And I suppose in a sense that's the starting point for me is this a product that, as an artist myself, because I still consider myself an artist, don't get into the studio very much, but is this a product of value, of use to an artist?
Sure.
So we're not building products built from an accounting position. It's not a case of, we could make more money by just putting this product onto the market that really has very little value to an artist in their painting practice.
Sure.
So yeah, and as I said, the other great thing really is to be able to have complete control of having built the business from scratch, and know that in a sense the whole nature of having set up my own company is almost an act of art in itself. It's a creative activity.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
What a great service to be able to provide to the arts community as well, having come from that background, being in the art school in the 1980s in England, and then eventually moving into Robertson and Co. and Cornelius and Son. It's a great grounding for you to base the beginnings of your business on.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Now, moving forward, David, in 1990 you find yourself in Australia.
Yeah.
Moving forward to 1992, the beginnings of Langridge Artist Colours. Your first location was in Langridge Street in Collingwood.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Correct.
Sure. Now, can you provide a little bit of a backstory as to the initial years of getting Langridge up and running on its feet, and how you got to this point? Because essentially, in the start, you didn't begin with paints. You began with varnishes and mediums. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. So can you talk a little bit about the early years of Langridge?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the big thing was that when I came to Australia, and I emigrated here in '92.
Yeah.
I did come out in 1990 purely on a working tourist visa, and I had to go back to the UK, went back to Cornelison's, learned to gain as much of my craft as I could, and then came back out to Australia. But I started with virtually nothing. I started with, I think my initial startup capital was $2,000.
Wow.
But, with passion, if you have passion and you're prepared to rough it a bit, you can, within reason, you can do anything. So what happened was that I would have part-time jobs, which I would go to during the day. I had built on a very early Mac computer, a very simple, basic price list, which, as you mentioned, no paints on there, a small selection of pigments, as we have behind us here, but nowhere near the range we have now, and a small but important range of artist mediums, oils and solvents and varnishes.
Sure.
And the reason why I started there is because that's what I could afford to make.
Right.
The biggest issue with paint making is that you need certain machines to be able to do it. And those machines are not cheap, even on the second-hand market. We're talking tens of thousands.
Wow.
So it took me many years to build up the capital to be able to purchase that kind of machinery.
Sure.
So I started the business basically at the lowest entry point I could, which was, as I said, making the mediums and the solvents was by far the easiest way. But I built them very specific and uniquely compared to our competitors around the world. There are many brands making artist mediums, and I made ours in a very specific way. In particular, we pushed the use of stand oil, which is polymerized linseed oil, as our base oil for our mediums, because it's a virtually non-yellowing oil compared to straight painting oils like linseed in particular, which does have a tendency to shift a little bit with age and colour.
Sure.
It may not be a big issue for many artists, but we want to allow artists to have complete security in the colour stability and obviously the integrity of the paint film.
Sure.
So I set up the company. I had that small price list. I went around the stores I could go to in Melbourne. I used to take the red-eye buses because they were the cheapest way of getting to Sydney and Brisbane. I still remember taking the bus up to Sydney overnight, being dropped off at the Sydney Central bus station, going into the bathrooms there, shaving, brushing my hair, washing, changing my clothes into more business-like clothes, and then going to see the stores as though I'd, of course, just flown in. It was all smoke and mirrors, okay, yeah. And I slowly built up a clientele of art retailers, those who, and I do always take my hat off to them, who took a great chance with me because they didn't know me at all. And they very much gave me that first leg up to allow me to create some income.
Sure.
But that still wasn't enough money coming in from that. So what I also had was part-time jobs. I couldn't afford a fax machine, but the printers who were just around the corner from where I was living from, which was above the factory in Langridge Street, they had a fax number, and they let me use that fax number. So all my price lists, when retailers were sending in orders by fax, and of course we're talking the 90s when they were still faxes, I would go to work at an ice cream making factory or in a craft store or wherever it happened to be, and I did many jobs for those first 2 years.
Sure.
And at the end of the day, I'd pass by the printers, pick up my orders, make and pack the orders that night, book in with our freight company in the morning, and then I'd go off to work again.
Wow.
And that's how I did it for years. And this was all, of course, in a pre-digital age, pre-mobile phone age, so that everything was much more analog, and it was a lot more in a way it was kind of good because it almost created a smokescreen. People couldn't, it was impenetrable, they couldn't see that it was, when I say we, and this is another thing, I always use the word we, but it was just me. It was only me, so I did everything. And then I had a couple of staff members who worked part-time with me as we started to build up, and then my wife Louise joined the company as well, and at that point we started to really gain some traction, and we moved from the Collingwood factory because we'd run out of space and bought the factory here in Yarraville, which obviously massively increased our actual sort of warehousing space. And the other thing that happened in the very early 2000s was we were offered the exclusive distribution for Golden Artist Colours.
That's right.
The acrylics from America, and certainly recognised as the world's leading artist acrylic, and one of the beautiful simpatico between what I was interested in achieving in the quality of our mediums for oil painters against Golden with what they were doing, but for acrylic painters. So we didn't cross over, we had separate lines. They did acrylics, I did oils, but it meant that we were still very much of the same, attempting to do the same quality and the same approach to our customers. We wanted to offer to our customers, our artists, the highest quality.
Fantastic. Yeah. That's great. And Williamsburg Artist Colours is someone that you also partnered with, is that correct?
Well, what happened was that the late Karl Plansky had set up Williamsburg in the 1980s, and he had moved the factory not very far from the Golden factory, and Karl and his sister were very good friends with the Golden family. They're only, as I said, about a 20-minute drive from each other. This is in upstate New York. Okay, about 3.5-4 hours north of Manhattan.
Okay, right.
And unfortunately, Carl passed away about 9 years ago. And at that point, Williamsburg decided to sell to Golden. They felt that Golden would do justice to the legacy of Carl's interest in his oil paints, and with his very particular idea about how to mill oil paints.
Sure.
And the difference between Williamsburg oil paints, as an example, and Langridge's, and that's probably the most pertinent. At Langridge, in particular, because we're mostly interested in modern synthetic pigments.
Yeah.
Carl was very interested in traditional pigments, and he also milled those colours very slightly differently depending on the colour, which often gives it quite a gritty quality, which a lot of artists like. And then we offer, obviously, even in Langridge range, some natural earth colours, so yellow ochre, the siennas and the umbers, but we tend to mill them a bit further, and we tend to make them smoother.
Sure.
More bodied, and it's really more than anything else down to the artist and their personal, what they like out of a paint. The one paint is not better than the other. We're very, very proud to be the Williamsburg distributor as well, and we would certainly classify Williamsburg alongside ourselves as probably in the top 5 paint makers in the world.
Fantastic. That's great.
Yeah.
Now, the artist paint manufacturing industry is relatively small, especially here in Australia. There aren't too many companies that are making artist paints. And throughout the world, if we look at Europe and such, there are a lot of reputable brands that have been around for many, many years, and a lot of artists have actually gained the trust of these particular manufacturers and continue to purchase their paint regularly. Now, in saying that, what's the underlying philosophy of Langridge artist colours, and how do you differ to other paint manufacturing companies that are out there?
That's a great question, and it's an important one, because when I decided to actually finally launch our oil paints, the question for me was, why does the world need another oil paint? There are some great brands out there, and there are enormous amounts of brands in quality, depending on what you're looking at, and often that reflects in price. But in particular, there were some great paint makers, and it was like, why are we doing this? Why would an artist want to buy ours, which is untested, untried, we're brand new, compared to a brand like, say, Blocks, which is one of the finest, again, oil paint brands in the world, who have been doing it for 130 years.
Wow. Yeah.
What I realised, and probably maybe because I came from Britain, one of the biggest things I've always been aware of in Australia, even here in Melbourne, which obviously can be a bit gloomier than, say, being up north, the fact of the matter is the amount of light.
Sure.
And the quality of that light. Like, that light in Australia is dry. It's not filtered through moisture. It's not a hazy colour. It's a very direct type of light. And when it strikes objects, and it strikes the colour on those objects, they vibrate in a completely different way to something that's a much sort of cooler colour, or maybe less intense.
Sure.
And that stuck me on the path of the idea of creating a colour range that was far more contemporary. I mean, I must admit, I looked across at acrylic paint makers, and I saw some of their palette, their range, and there were some superb modern poppy colours.
Yeah.
And I was not seeing those in oils, and I'm thinking, why should artists in oil painting be denied these colours? And I know that, I've always been in very direct contact with a lot of contemporary artists, and I could see that they were looking for these types of colours. That, we want to be able to look after artists who are working in a very traditional manner, with a very, kind of subdued palette.
Sure.
But all the way through into colours that are, in a sense, completely synthetic looking and unnatural. So that was the impetus for me, was to create a range that was brighter, more saturated, and especially with many of our, what we call our unique blended colours that are proprietorial, such as our brilliant magenta, colours that kind of look like plastic, or colours that look like they've been generated by a computer screen or something like that.
Yeah.
Because I think that, in a way, those are colours that describe the world around us in a much more holistic experience than obviously an experience that's something that I grew up with. I mean, there were no computers when I was 20 years old.
Sure.
Or they were, but they were, they were supercomputers, mainframes, and they weren't personal computers. And our world has changed enormously, and our interaction with imagery has changed. The ubiquitousness of computers and also, of course, mobile phones, means that our actual, often the information and the way that we receive our visual information is now all through generated imagery, as opposed to either an actual painting in a gallery, or as probably we always when I was an art student, through big monographic books, with beautiful high quality plates. And of course, with printing, that's still basically using pigments, the same pigments in the sense that we use in making our artist quality paints. But screens, of course, are being built from light, so it's RGB. And the nature of that changes the way that we view the relationship between those colors and between darks and lights.
Sure.
And I wanted to replicate that, or at least give a hint of that kind of contemporary interaction with color.
Amazing.
Yeah.
That's fantastic, because originally you had started with 32 colors.
Yeah.
And then over time you slowly expanded your color range to include some of the more synthetic modern pigments as well, the quinacodones and naphthols. Recently, or not too recently, but a couple of years ago, you released Video Green as well, which is a fantastic fluoro green color. And that's really good that you're staying up to date with the changing color sensibilities of our contemporary era. What I want to ask, David, is how important is it for Langridge artist colors to maintain the integrity of the core set of traditional artist pigments? How important is that for you to keep those in your mainstay, and to make sure that you're continuing to replenish those when you do sell out?
Yeah. Look, there are core colors that have seemed to have lasted humankind from literally prehistory.
Sure.
And of course they're ochres and maybe lamp blacks and chalk whites. There's a reason why they've lasted. They not only were initially because they were so easily accessible, we could be grabbed from the earth itself, from the ground beneath us, but also because there's some kind of quality in the palette using a series of these earth colors. They fit together in a painting passage in a very sympathetic way. They hold together. They're also some of the still most structurally strong colors, in the sense that the pigments tend to be bigger than a lot of the modern pigments, and that gives structure to the actual paint, and so that the paint film will hold up with integrity longer than probably many of the modern synthetic colors, which are divided. They're so tiny, it actually kind of unfortunately does create very slightly weaker film than these kind of much more bold, grainier kind of pigments. So we have always had the natural ochres. I've also always been a very big fan of what we call the prepared iron oxides, which are chemically identical to their natural counterparts, except for the fact that they're chemically purer. There are none of the impurities. Now, it doesn't mean that the ochres are lesser quality. It means they're slightly different. Those impurities, and I mean by impurities things like bits of silica, maybe other extraneous minerals in there, create the subtleties in a yellow ochre that its yellow oxide, which is the prepared iron oxide equivalent, doesn't have. An iron oxide, prepared iron oxide, is extremely bold and opaque, and very, very strong in tinctorial color. So bang for your buck, the synthetic iron oxides are far better for you than the natural alternatives. But the issue is that you may lose some of the subtlety, and that's why it's still very important for us to actually keep some of those natural ochres, and we'll hopefully introduce a couple more as we go forward. My biggest concern, however, is that we keep the direction of Langridge, its palette, as being about contemporary color, which does mean kind of heightened chromatic values, so much poppier, stronger, intense colors. And of course the ochres, in the sense of the complete opposite end of the spectrum in that sense. So I won't ever end up populating our range of colors with lots and lots of ochres. There are brands out there, you mentioned Williamsburg, that do it so well. They have a fabulous range of ochre pigments, way beyond what we do at Langridge, and what personally that I want to do at Langridge. I want my direction to be going down that path of, as I said, taking advantage of developments in modern pigment technology, brighter colours, stable colours, which allow artists then to intermix in a much cleaner fashion.
So with the advancements in technology that we now have, David, would you say that the traditional iron oxide pigments or the synthetic modern day pigments are more stable? Which one's more reliable?
I hate to say it, one of the issues a lot of oil painters experience when they're painting with the natural iron oxides, or what we call ochres.
Sure.
We get a thing called sinking in.
Okay.
Which I'm sure you're aware of. I'm sure many of your audience are aware of. And in particular, often becomes evident with darker ochre colours, such as the umbers,
Right.
burnt umber in particular, whereby you've painted down a passage of burnt umber, a dark colour, and after a few days, as the surface has dried, you start to see a patchiness. Some areas are kind of glossier, other areas seem to have gone dull, dead.
Sure.
And this is the nature, unfortunately, of the complex chemical build-up or makeup, I should say, of the umbers.
Mm-hmm.
And it unfortunately tends to lend itself to this kind of experience happening. The synthetic iron oxides don't do that. They are far more simple in a sense because they're more chemically pure.
Sure.
And they tend to remove those issues. And I know many educators internationally who are very much into traditional oil painting, and even they will say you would be better off using prepared iron oxides rather than the natural ochres.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that I want to say to people don't use them.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that everything inherently comes with an upside and a downside.
Sure.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Sure. Yeah.
That's a great way of putting it. I mean, because we are living in contemporary times, why not take advantage of some of the technologies that we have around us
Sure.
to help us with our creative practices?
Yeah.
Now, moving forward to more recent times, David, 2017 was a big year for you.
Yeah.
You had your very successful exhibition titled Chromatopia here in Melbourne, which showcased the backstory, a lot of the historical pigments, and how they were attained and prepared for artist use over the centuries. Now, that exhibition led to Thames and Hudson approaching you and asking you if you would like to basically write a book based on the subject of the exhibition. Can you provide a little bit of backstory as to how all that unfolded? Because it's quite a significant event that occurred.
Yeah, be careful when talking to friends and you have a small kernel of an idea and then they also get super excited and then you all start unfortunately getting on a bit of a roll. And what was going to be a very small exhibition, due to a conversation with Tim Bateson and Keith Lawrence, who are the owners of Tacit Gallery, who are long-term friends of myself and Louise, and we met up with them to talk about being able to take two spaces, literally two rooms, because it was a multi-space gallery, take up two rooms to have a small exhibition. And over the course of the evening, we all got more and more excited about the idea. It's at the point at the end of the evening, they had offered me the whole gallery, all 9 spaces, which turned the whole thing into a completely different type of event.
Yeah.
And also allowed it then to become far more ambitious. So the idea, of course, is, as you mentioned, is that I wanted to put together an exhibition, physical exhibition, to explain the origins of colour.
Sure.
Because over the years that I've been talking to students and to other artists and talks and workshops I've given over the years, when I start talking about where colours come from, people are amazed and they haven't realised that colour comes from something.
Absolutely.
And the idea for them often is that colour is abstract, that it just is. So that paint is orange, or that piece of plastic is blue, or and it's not. Of course, there's a colouring matter, physical, that's gone in there. That colouring matter's had to come from somewhere.
Sure.
That is a pigment, and historically, in particular, those stories, those origin stories of pigments, are quite extraordinary. Partly because they were so difficult to get hold of. Often they were extremely dangerous, either again to source or to use, because we have materials that are based on mercury and arsenic and other horrible materials.
Sure.
And I just thought it would be fabulous to be able to show it, and in a physical way, almost like a museum exhibition. Right. So I really spent probably more than anything else on putting the show together on all of the display jars and all of the cases, because I wanted to really show off large quantities of pigment. That a colour like Rose Madder comes from the roots of a madder plant from India.
Right.
And the whole process of extracting the dye from that root and then converting that dye into a lake pigment.
Sure.
And that lake pigment, rose madder, being used for the most beautiful watercolors and oil paints. And this story keeps getting repeated over and over again with all of these, in particular, historic colors. Now, the modern pigments, unfortunately, don't have so much poetry to them.
Right.
They're built in giant laboratory vessels. It's very much a chemical interchange, and there's really not much to say and not much to see. So when pigments really invented, created before the 19th century, are the pigments that I concentrated on in the Chromatopia exhibition.
Sure.
Because you could show something that it came from, a mineral that was dug up that it came from, or a plant, or an insect, or an animal.
Yeah.
And they all have these extraordinary origin stories.
It's fascinating.
Yeah. And sorry, I was going to say Thames and Hudson were fantastic because they saw the opportunity to get this story to even more people, because we only did that exhibition in Melbourne for 2.5 weeks. We did get the most incredible response from the public. We had queues of 20 people waiting every morning for the doors to open.
Wow.
We had people flying in from interstate.
That's incredible.
So it was the most fantastic response, and it just showed everybody that there is real thirst for that kind of information.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. So moving on from there, David, it's been interesting listening to your discussion and reflecting upon how Langridge Artist Colours came to be where it currently is today. Looking towards the future now, what are some of the things that you have in store in moving forward, and what do you hope to ultimately achieve through this mission?
Well, what we got in store, 8 new colours coming out later this year.
Oh, great.
So we've been working on those. A mixture of bold modern colours,
Sure.
a couple of more traditional colours, just to keep the balance right, and also because we've been listening to our artists, which is really very much the central mandate of why Langridge exists, is we work with artists in partnership, and
Sure.
as I said to you before, we're not building materials that they don't need, they are of great value to them. So 8 new colours. We're about to introduce a whole range of natural dyes. So we're actually going to move a little bit as an extension of our pigments, we're going to move into the natural dye industry.
Oh, wow.
So we've been sourcing from around the world, natural indigo from India, cochineal from Mexico, a range of buckthorn berries from Turkey, and madder root and madder powder from India, and it goes on and
That's
on
right.
like that. And why do I do this? What's the legacy? The legacy, or where I see Langridge ending up. What I really want to be able to do from here now, we've cemented our reputation in this country. We're building a reputation overseas, but what we really want to be able to do is to get into markets overseas, so that American, European, East Asian, basically artists wherever they are in the world,
Sure.
have an opportunity to use our paints, mediums, if they so desire.
Absolutely.
And for Langridge to really stand up there and be recognised alongside the other great paint makers that I respect and would like to be able to say with great pride, that's my paint I can see in a gallery.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You've also owned an art store. You and your wife Louise own an art store in Smith Street, which is St. Luke Artist Colourman.
Yeah.
And I understand they're going to be moving shortly?
Yeah, we just we found a space right directly opposite, much larger than where we are now, and we're in the process of working out how we're going to fit everything out. But we're super excited because we want to make it one of the most exciting, sexy art shops in the world. I want it to be one of the greatest art shops in the world, but in a contemporary sense, as opposed to, say, a Cornelissen or Sennelier in Europe, which are very much beautiful tradition. We want to do something about the 21st century.
Sure.
So that's our big, super project for the middle of this year as well. Yeah,
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, David, it's been great hearing more about your story and learning about your origins and how this fantastic company, Langridge Artist Colours, came to be. Now I understand we're going to be looking at some milling of oil paint today.
Yeah.
What colours are we going to be observing?
We're going to be looking at the process of milling the video green that you mentioned earlier. So we'll have a look at the initial mixing process and then the actual milling on the triple roll mill.
Fantastic.
All right.
That sounds great. Lead the way.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to explain to you how oil paints are made. The great thing about oil paints is they're very simple beasts compared to acrylics that we were talking about before. In essence, they're really just two components. There's the binding oil, which generally will be a linseed oil, whether that's refined or cold pressed. Secondly, we need the pigment, the colouring matter. Now, generally it will be a single pigment type, but we're making here video green, and video green is made as a blend of our phthalo green, blue shade, and our arylide lemon. Mixed together in the mixing machine here, we're allowing the pigment to be wetted down so it's now a paste. But only about 50% of the milling or dispersing action is going on. We'll be taking this material as a paste and taking it to the triple roll mill for full dispersion. And the term dispersion is by which we are separating all the individual pigments from each other so that they're being individually coated in the oil and thereby giving us a stable, strong oil paint. I'm going to switch it on now so you can see. And what you can see here is a beautiful thick paste that for many of us we might even think is actually the finished paint. But if you look closely you can see it's quite dull and it's a little bit grainy. The dullness of course is because the pigment particles haven't been fully coated, so they're not lovely and glossy because of that kind of full immersion in the binding oil. And this will be done for around about 2 hours depending on the colours that we're working with, and then once we feel that it's been mixed well enough we can then take it to the triple roll mill. Okay, so what we've got here is the paint making in full swing. This is the triple roll mill. It's 3 rollers running at different speeds and running in opposite directions to each other. What it means is that as the paste runs between the rollers, that space is so small that the pigment particles in the paste have to be separated from each other before they can pass through. And as they get separated, they then get coated in the binding oil, the drying oil, linseed oil in this case. And this is the nature of making artist's oil paints. In fact, it's the nature of making all paints, separating the pigments from each other so there's no dry pigment against dry pigment. Each pigment is separated and coated individually in its vehicle, its binder. This is now the second pass. We will do this 6 times. Take the material, we pass this through, we collect it, we put it back into the hopper, and with each pass we close the spacing between the rollers, making it more and more difficult for the pigment particles to stay clumped together, to what we call agglomerate. And by doing that, we create a true, fully dispersed paint. And you can already see on this second pass that the paint is now much glossier, much smoother, and that's because those pigment particles would have been dry and reflecting a very matte finish and now showing a saturated gloss finish. Also, the material is now much smoother. You can see it's got a beautiful buttery, unctuous quality, and this will keep developing with every pass, and as we make that space smaller, we can make it more and more fully dispersed. It's an electric colour, as you can see, and I built this colour out of colours, pigments, physical colour, to replicate light-generated colours, things that you see on a computer screen. It's never going to be the same as that. It's an approximation, it's an analogue equivalent to the idea of colour generated by light. I hope you understand that the process of making paint isn't simple. It's quite dedicated with enormous amounts of skill and expertise built into it. With each pass, we keep a constant eye on how the colour is developing. Some are easy, some are very, very difficult. But in the end, what we're trying to achieve is a fully developed, easily spreadable, movable material that we call paint, that is there for artists to use in their practice of their creative expeditions. I hope that explaining this all to you has given you a better understanding of the dedication of paint makers around the world, and obviously in particular us here at Langridge, in making these materials. So I obviously showed you earlier how we actually make the paint, and what's important to understand is that we also have quality controls to make sure that we're making the paint to the quality that we need it to be. And there are 2 types of ways we can do this. The first one is what's called a fineness of grind gauge, or sometimes known as a Hegman gauge. And basically it's a stainless steel piece of equipment which has 2 channels running, starting of a depth of about 120 micron, running all the way up to 0. And with this we're able to just basically use a scraper blade, and we can see if there's any agglomerations of the pigment, which I mentioned in the paint making process. We want the pigment particles to be fully separated, to be lubricated and slide over each other. And if we have any material that hasn't been fully dispersed, it will exhibit itself in one of these channels at a certain point, and we can tell how well we've actually dispersed the pigments, and if we need to actually do more paint making. We actually have to run it through the machine, maybe 1 or 2 more passes. The other thing that we do also just before final completion of the paint is we do a drawdown test, and we use basically a card called a Lanita card. It's a varnish coated card, white and black, and the reason for this is to measure relative opacity of the paint in comparison to previous batches, and to also by adding a controlled amount of white to the original mass colour, so that we've got the same type of colour in tint after they've been mixed together, and again so that it matches any previous batch of this same colour we've made. And finally we scrape the paint down and we can see what we call its undertone. So here we're taking a colour we milled this morning, which is called Paleotan Lemon, one of the modern inorganic hybrid pigments. It's very beautifully opaque, and it's been very much being pushed as a kind of non-toxic replacement to the cadmiums. Not that, to be honest with you, cadmium pigments actually have any real issue with toxicity to artists in their use. This is a Paleotan Lemon, and you can see here the little, what we call tongue on the my left, your right hand side, is the Paleotan in mass tone. This on here is the tint, where we've mixed it with 4 parts of a control white. In this case we always use the Langridge titanium white to make a tint, and we run these down using a gauge, scraper gauge, which gives us basically a 10 micron thick film, and then we just scrape off at the very bottom the majority of the paint film so we can see the undertone. We then compare this to our drawdown cards for the same colour we've made previously, make sure that there's no difference in the tint or the undertone or even the mass tone, and once we can OK that, we can QC correct, say it's there, it's done, and we can fill it into our paint tubes, and then it can be sent out into the marketplace. It's a pretty straightforward and very simple, direct way, but it's one of the most effective ways to make sure that we get making a paint to the exacting standards that we expect of our paint, and we believe that our artists can, care about when they're buying our paint.
Thank you very much for inviting me to the Langridge Artist Colour Paint Factory today. It's been a real inspiration being here and seeing each step of the creative process that you guys go through in regards to preparing your pigments and then mulling them on the triple mill roller, the cleanliness of your factory, and the integrity that you take in each of the steps of the process is really something that I admire. And congratulations on your journey as well. You're a true entrepreneur. I mean, it's incredible how you came from those humble beginnings down in Langridge Street, Collingwood, just selling your varnishes and your mediums, to essentially getting to the point where you're able to offer over 70 artist colours and distribute your products throughout Australia and eventually hopefully worldwide as well. Yeah. Congratulations on that. It's a true inspiration. And I hope that a lot more of the Australian artists, a lot more painters in Australia come to use Langridge handmade colours in their painting practice. And for viewers that may be listening or watching this particular video, where can they purchase the Langridge artist colours? Is there particular distributors that we have around Melbourne?
The easiest way for most of your viewers to be able to find out is to go to the Langridge website, which is langridgecolours.com.
Sure.
And then we have a stockist page there, and that will list over 80 stockist retailers around the country, plus a few of our international retailers as well. And I also want to mention in particular our flagship store here in Melbourne, which is called St. Luke Artist Colourmen, which is stlukeart.com. And there we carry all of the products, and again supported by the information base that we think is critical to interaction between ourselves as manufacturers, suppliers, to the actual users, to artists themselves.
Fantastic. Do they do online shipping as well? Online shopping, so
they have a complete
online?
e-commerce site there as well. So again, for domestic or international clients, we're very happy to be able to deal with those, do it on a daily basis. But as I said, you may find that there are want to buy locally, and that we totally support that. And so if you go and have a look at the stockists, you'll find retailers nationwide who'll be able to help you if you want to walk straight in and have a look.
Fantastic. And are you still doing the talks to the various art schools in Melbourne?
I am. I will keep that partnership going. So we've continued for over 20 years my conversations with workshops to the students from RMIT, VCA, University of Melbourne Conservation. The last year has been a little bit difficult because, of course, of COVID,
Sure.
but we've been doing quite a lot online. And obviously we will hope to reintroduce that back with physical visits for school groups at the tertiary level in the coming year.
Fantastic. Good luck with all that, David. Let's keep in touch, and I wish you the very best with your business as we progress into the future.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank you,
very
Emilio.
much.
And
All the
thank you
best.
so much for coming along today. I'm very happy to have you and see the processes we're doing here.
It's been my pleasure, David. Fantastic. Thanks again.
Okay, thank you.